Hello, this is Eric Michael Loyd. I have a master's in psychology, neuropsychology concentration. Today I want to read two things. One was to give tribute to women's successes over the last 3 centuries. There's a lot more than this. This is just a truncated list. This is rightathome.net. Women's movement successes of the past 3 centuries. International Women's Day celebrates the achievement of women. The theme of this year is hashtag Be Bold for Change, which encourages all of us to play an active role in making gender equality a reality. Okay. In January, hundreds of thousands of women attended the Women's March in the United States. Here's a look at some of the major accomplishments of the women's movement over the years. 1850, the women's movement gets organized. 2 years after the famous Seneca Falls Convention, which helped define what the women's movement would entail, the first National Women's Rights Convention took place in Massachusetts. Over 1,000 people attended, and the convention became an annual event. 1893, states begin to grant women the right to vote. Colorado becomes the first state to adopt an amendment granting women the right to vote. Utah and Idaho followed in 1896. In 1910, Washington State jumped on board, along with California in 1911, and Kansas, Oregon, and Arizona in 1912. 1903, a union is formed for working women. The National Women's Trade Union League was formed to, quote, assist in the organization of women wage workers into trade unions and thereby to help them secure conditions necessary for healthful and efficient work and to obtain a just reward for such work. The effort bonded women across economic and social divides, attracting, quote, a coalition of working-class women, professional reformers, and women from wealthy and prominent families. 1916. Women gain access to birth control. As a nurse in immigrant communities, Margaret Sanger met many women who experienced multiple childbirths, miscarriages, and self-induced abortions because they lacked the proper information about how to avoid unwanted pregnancy. She decided to take matters into her own hands, opening up the first family planning and birth control clinic in Brooklyn, New York. While she faced initial challenges with this first clinic, her idea eventually evolved into Planned Parenthood. 1920, the 19th Amendment becomes law. Congress finally ratified the 19th Amendment in 1920, granting women across the United States the right to vote and moving one step closer toward equality for women. 1963, Congress passes the Equality Pay Act. President John F. Kennedy appointed Eleanor Roosevelt chairwoman of the President's Commission of the Status of Women in 1961, and a report published by the Commission in 1963 found, quote, substantial discrimination against women in the workplace. As a result, Congress passed the Equal Pay Act, aimed at eradicating the pay gap between men and women. 1972, like the 1972 Dolphins, Title IX brings equal opportunity to education. Title IX, known as the Patsy Mink Equal Opportunity in Education Act, was authored by Senator Birch Bayh of Indiana. It brought greater educational opportunities to women. The 1964 Civil Rights Act included gender equality, but it left out public education. Title IX had an especially significant impact on American sports because it required high schools and colleges to provide equal opportunities for female athletes. The landmark legislation is credited with greatly increasing the participation of young women in sports. 2013, ban on women in combat is lifted. Well, many may have different views about this. I'm not going to read through this anyway. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta petitioned the Joint Chiefs of Staff to reverse a 1994 rule that prevented women from serving in combat. The result, an announcement from the chairman, General Martin Dempsey, that said, "The time has come to rescind the direct combat exclusion for women and to eliminate all unnecessary gender-based barriers to service." Hillary Young is a writer dedicated to helping older Americans live healthier, more fulfilling lives. You can find her on Twitter at HYoungCreative. Okay. Wanted to read today from uscourts.gov. Something popped in my mind today about Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall profile. Brown versus Board of Education, the reenactment. As a lawyer and judge, Thurgood Marshall strived to protect the rights of all citizens. His legacy earned him the nickname Mr. Civil Rights. Thurgood Marshall was born Thurgood Marshall on June 2nd, 1908 in Baltimore, Maryland. Tired of having his friends poke fun at his name, he decided to improve the situation and, at the age of 6, legally changed it to Thurgood. As a young man, perhaps the person who had the most influence on him was his father, a man who always told his son to stand up for his beliefs. His father's influence was so strong that later in life, Marshall once said that his father, quote, "never told me to become a lawyer. He turned me into one," end quote. Early life. Arguably, Marshall's introduction to law came in high school when, as a punishment for a prank that he had pulled, the school's principal made him read the U.S. Constitution. Marshall immediately liked the document and set about memorizing various parts of it. He took special interest in Article 3 and the Bill of Rights. Article 3 establishes the judicial branch of government, and the Bill of Rights lists the rights that all American citizens are supposed to enjoy. Growing up in an era when Jim Crow laws still permeated much of the country, Marshall knew that many African Americans were not enjoying all of their constitutional rights. From an early age, Marshall was aware of racial inequalities, injustices in the United States, and he decided to do something about them. Moreover, he also knew that the courts might be the best means for doing so. Education. Excuse me. Marshall attended the all-black Lincoln University, the oldest African-American institution of higher education in the country, and after being rejected from the University of Maryland School of Law because of his race, went to attend law school at Howard University and graduated first in his class. It was at Howard University that Marshall met Charles Hamilton Houston, the vice dean of the law school. In 1935, Houston directed the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, and Marshall was his right-hand man. It was during this time that Marshall realized that the holding in Plessy, which is Plessy versus Ferguson, was inherently flawed, for, quote, separate could never be, quote, equal. Marshall had always felt that the only way for African Americans, or anyone for that matter, to succeed was to receive an education. Yet, the discrepancy in the caliber of education for whites and blacks was made all too apparent to him when, one day, while traveling with Houston, Marshall witnessed a black child biting into an orange. He had received such a poor education that he neither knew what it was nor how to properly eat it. From this point on, Marshall and Houston were dedicated to a strategy which aimed at ending segregation. Legal career. Together with Houston, Marshall participated in cases Murray versus Maryland, 1936, Missouri ex rel Gaines versus Canada, 1938. When Houston returned to private practice in 1938, Marshall took over the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund and argued that Sweat versus Painter, 1950, and McLaurin versus Oklahoma Board of Regents of Higher Education, 1950. Having won these cases and thus establishing precedents for chipping away Jim Crow laws in higher education, Marshall succeeded in having the Supreme Court declare segregated public schools unconstitutional in Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. That's, I think, the one that I know about, and most people do. After Brown, Marshall argued many more court cases in support of civil rights. His zeal for ensuring the rights of all citizens, regardless of race, caught the attention of President John F. Kennedy, who appointed him to the U.S. Court of Appeals. In 1965, Lyndon Johnson appointed him to the post of Solicitor General. This person argues cases on behalf of the U.S. government before the Supreme Court. It is the third highest office in the Justice Department. Finally, in 1967, President Johnson appointed him to the U.S. Supreme Court. Until his retirement from the court in 1991, Marshall continued to strive to protect the rights of all citizens. Thurgood Marshall died in 1993, leaving behind a legacy that earned him the nickname, quote, Mr. Civil Rights. Before his funeral, his flag-draped casket was laid in state in the Great Hall of the Supreme Court. He was only the second justice to be given this honor. There's a downloadable activity here as well, and then related links. And it also has a video that anyone can watch. I'll include that in the link to this video. So again, my name is Eric Michael Loyd. I have a master's in psychology, neuropsychology concentration. Thank you for your time.